Let me begin with the big broad question. How do you assess the war that began on 10/7? How is that war going? That means all of it.
On 10/7, Israel went to war against an idea, not against a specific militia, even though that specific militia is absolutely our enemy. It wants to murder my children. It says so every day. You have to be a very particular kind of Western ideologue not to hear it when it's their fundamental idea. We certainly went to war with Hamas, but we looked around and we said, wait a second, how could Hamas want this war in Gaza? What is the meaning of these tunnels, the biggest tunnel system in the history of war? I mean, just the most comprehensive system that means that the only way to get to Hamas is to go through Palestinian cities, is to blow up entire regions in order to blow up what is by far, I mean, fivefold the next biggest military tunnel system. It's the biggest thing Palestinians have ever built, and Hamas spent Gaza's entire economy for 15 years on building it. And so this is the war, this way that Gaza looks. This was what Hamas planned. This was what it would take to get Hamas out of those tunnels, and it wasn't enough to get Hamas out of those tunnels. And critique Israel all you want. I think it's really important to critique wars, and this was a war fought in an urban environment with civilian dead in the many thousands. So this is not. But my point is a strategic, tactical one. How would Hamas possibly plan, build a war in which the only possibility for the enemy coming for you after you commit a massacre like that and announce many times since October 7th that you will commit it again and again and will never not commit it? So the enemy's going to come for you. And then you build this tunnel system. And then in 2.5 years of war, after building what is basically the most comprehensive bomb shelter system in the history of war, not letting a single Gazan child into it for 2.5 years? What is that? How do you understand these things? Assume that Hamas isn't stupid or crazy. Assume that it's normative, real, thoughtful human beings who live in a certain world and are responding to how they see the world. And it turns out that the idea driving Hamas is this particular idea. It's called in Arabic the mukawama. It translates into resistance in English, but that doesn't describe what the word means. What the word means in Arabic is something much, much bigger. It's a kind of mass martyrdom ideology in which Muslim thinkers over the last century and a half have tried to explain why Islam is so far behind the West. And one of the streams that come out of this conversation between theologians and political leaders has been this stream called the Muslim Brothers or the Salafists or the basically jihadi radicals, however you call them, is this stream that says we are very weak, but our weakness is a kind of purity. The Westerners are very powerful, but that makes them also arrogant. The weak and humble are closer to God by definition. And so God will intercede on our behalf. How do we get God to intercede on our behalf in the great civilizational war against the arrogant, powerful West? Martyrdom, sacrifice, mass martyrdom and sacrifice that demonstrates our faith, that brings God into history to intervene and allow us to defeat the great powers of the West. This is the animating idea behind the Iranian regime. Khomeini, the founder of this regime, talked about the mustadafin, the humble, defeating the mustakbirin, the powerful, the arrogant, and explicitly explained that martyrdom was the path that closes that gap between weak and powerful. It's a way of thinking about the world that instead of looking at the West as a kind of successful best practice, right? Democracies, it turns out, build better economies. Stronger political systems, more stability. When you're switching out your leader every few years, you tend to be a more stable political system than when you're just a bunch of tyrants who inherit from each other. All of these best practices the West brought, instead of that being the secret to the West's power and success and scientific advancement, it's a way of saying, actually, none of that is true. We're all living through a kind of mystical religious situation, and if we just are willing to die enough and to have our people die enough, and that's how then we win. And that's how and the victory is a religious victory. And that's how you produce a Hamas that plans the destruction of Gaza as its foundational strategy and force multiplier. And we looked around the region after understanding that on October 8th. And we said, well, that's Hezbollah. Hezbollah is absolutely willing to have Lebanon destroyed in the Great War to defeat the arrogant Israeli power, Western power, which is how they frame it. And that's Iran. Iran talks about us as the little Satan and America as the big Satan. It's not that it hates America because America supports Israel. It hates Israel because it sees Israel as part of America. In other words, America is the thing it hates most and first and most profoundly. And if people want to understand why, you have to go to Ali Shariati. That's the name to Google, and you will discover a kind of Marxist theoretician who melded Shia eschatology with Marxist ideas in the 1960s and 70s and was Khomeini's great teacher on these issues. And so they see us as that, and they're coming for us, and they're undeterrable because they believe that martyrdom is strength. And if you have an enemy that is literally willing to burn their own society to the ground on the altar of the destruction of you because they believe God has decreed it, there's no deterrence. It's literally undeterrable, and there's no peace, and there's no compromise. You actually have to defeat this enemy. The Nazis actually
have to destroy
be defeated.
it. Now, for 20 years, maybe 17, I've been telling people they need to read Lawrence Wright's The Looming Tower to understand Sunni extremism and Qutb and the Muslim Brotherhood. After you did episode 93, which is your 2.5-hour extravaganza on resistance theology on the Shia side, then you followed it up with episode 99, which is the 1-hour version. I went and found a book entitled Iran's Grand Strategy of Political History by Vali Nasser, who's at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. And it's really good. And it's sort of a slower version for readers or listeners of what 93 and 99 do, but I was able to understand it. Are you familiar with that book?
I haven't read it. I know of its existence. I really ought to read it.
It makes the same points you do about maybe in a little less judgmental, a little more academic approach, but yours is more entertaining, and it made this a lot more understandable. When you have two enemies, Sunni fundamentalism, Wahhabist extremism, Al-Qaeda, and the Iranian regime, and they sometimes work together, and then you get a Zarqawi who will sometimes try and just go right after the Shia throat. There is no alternative except to destroy the Iranian regime. That's what John Fetterman said yesterday. Is there an alternative other than destroying the Iranian regime?
The idea has to die. It doesn't, if you can't literally destroy the regime because for 47 years, this regime has literally succeeded at nothing, built nothing, developed nothing, driven one of the wealthiest countries in the world naturally in terms of both human intelligence and in terms of hydrocarbon reserves, has driven its economy into the ground. So this is a regime that has done nothing but destroy every part of Iranian society that could possibly have built out any kind of power center to oppose the regime. There's simply no one organized in Iran, in Iranian society, the Iranians made sure of it, who could resist, who could organize against this regime. So maybe the regime can't fall. But we don't actually need the institutions to fall. What we need is the idea to die. The idea that says we must destroy Israel on the path to destroying America and all of the arrogant West in order for Islam to be redeemed. And along the way, it's okay if the entire Iranian people chokes to death on our tyranny and on our incompetence. That idea.
Haviva, right before you went to break, you said the idea has to die. I hope it does, but in the meantime, there's a two-front war going on. The latest battle, 10/7 led to a battle in Gaza. There was a battle in Lebanon with Hezbollah. Now there's a battle over the skies of Iran, and there's a battle in southern Lebanon. How do you assess those two battles? Just like World War II had many fronts and many battles. Some were terrible, Tarawa. Some were the Marianas Turkey shoot. Others were really risky, Normandy. We've got two right now, Israel in southern Lebanon and Israel and America, and maybe the UAE and maybe Saudi Arabia joining in over the skies of Iran. How do you assess both of those battles and their immediate objectives? Not against the idea, but against the regime's power.
If you understand this war as a war against an ideological front, it's going astonishingly well. If you want to pick apart every single individual battle, it's going fairly astonishingly well in military terms. I don't know about political terms. Israel is certainly hated among many parts of the world right now. Some of that is propaganda. Some of that is that there is this terrible war in Gaza, but there was a worse war going on in Sudan nobody talked about or saw. There's a lot of discourse, a lot of propaganda. The Israelis and the Palestinians and the Iranians are symbols to a whole lot of ideologues all over the world. Israel certainly has a huge problem in terms of its public persona, public image on the world stage. Militarily, it is a victory every step of the way. People will then argue you can't kill an idea. People will then argue Hezbollah is still there. People will argue the Iranian regime hasn't fallen yet. It can still burn things to the ground on its way out. Maybe that means it can never be felled because nobody's willing to literally remove 20% of the oil supply for 5 years. Yeah, you could argue that, sure, but that would assume that Israel is thinking in the way most Westerners think about this war, which is to say we have a pinpoint problem, we're going to attack it with a pinpoint solution, and if it isn't all finished and within 2 weeks and we're all home drinking our eggnog, then we've lost. That is not how the Israelis are thinking about it. The Israelis are thinking about this in Middle Eastern terms. The idea will come for us in one form or another, no matter what we do in any one arena. So it has to be all the arenas, and the idea itself has to die. On October 8th, I went on a podcast and I was asked this question, what happens now? And one of my main arguments was, this is not going to be about Gaza. This is going to be the beginning of a war that must go to Hezbollah and a war that must go to Iran, and it might take 5 years. And I got some emails of people telling me, "What are you're silly. Not even you're a warmonger. That's a silly thing to say. Israel's not going to challenge Iran. Israel's not going to take on the costs, the 200,000 missiles and rockets hitting Tel Aviv that would be involved in attacking Hezbollah." And here we are 2.5 years later, and actually it is exactly what has happened. And so Israel is vastly more powerful than it was 2.5 years ago. Its enemies are vastly weaker than they were 2.5 years ago. And that has to continue, and it may have to continue for years more until the idea no longer makes any sense. And Hugh, I'm sorry to go on like this. Can I just one last point about this?
Please,
it's happened before. Our experience of this has happened before. In the 1950s and 60s, Israel, tiny little third world Israel that began its life rationing egg powder to children because they didn't have enough food to feed the children. Tiny, poor, impoverished Israel under a British and American arms embargo faced Arab armies united behind this charismatic Nasser with brand new Soviet hardware coming at them to demolish and annihilate them. And this idea of pan-Arabism that Nasser was selling, that unified Egypt and Syria briefly, that brought the Jordanians in and the Iraqis all to attack us all at once, again and again and again. This idea was basically the argument that if the Arabs lost in 48 because they were disunited, if they unite and remember their strength and remember their unity, the Jews stand no chance. How did that pan-Arabist idea die? We destroyed it in tank battles in the desert. So we've already been through this cycle, and we have to go through it again. And by the way, if we can't kill this mukawama idea, this terrorism, self-sacrificial mass martyrdom terrorism idea, it already doesn't stop in the Middle East. It's going to be exported everywhere because it works. It had better not work, and we're going to make sure it doesn't work.
Now, you already named the price, although I think you priced it too high. You said the world has to get along without 20% of its oil supply for 5 years. In fact, substitutionary effects will take place. People will find alternative forms of energy. Saudi's already opened up their pipeline that they haven't used for years. You can build a pipeline from Saudi Arabia through Israel to the Mediterranean. You can get the oil. It takes a year and a half to get the oil. And in the meantime, I think the world will produce more. America can produce more. And some costs will go up. I think it's worth it, whatever it takes. And I think Trump might think it's worth it. Do you think do you think UAE and Saudi Arabia have come around to the fact we cannot live across the strait from this fanatical, medieval, theological, crazy regime?
From 2015 to 2024, Iran took out something like 20 tankers in the Persian Gulf. And in the tanker war, in the Iran-Iraq war, there were 4 years where hundreds of tankers in the Persian Gulf were hit by this regime. This idea that every time it's in danger, it shoots up the global oil supply. You want to live under that shadow? I'll say more than that. The energy prices can be spiked at Iran's will because it can start blowing things up. That is its one strategy. It, by the way, has no other strategy. It has no air force that can fly. It has no navy that can sail. All it has is the ability to blow up somebody else's tankers, a more productive society and government's tankers. That's not any bad word against Persians. The Persian people are amazing. This regime can only destroy and only ever has. But I'll say another thing. Iran sits on something like the third largest hydrocarbon reserve in the world. We keep talking about, well, what will happen to the cost of energy if Iran blows up tankers in the Strait of Hormuz? Why don't we have this conversation about what happens to the cost of energy if the Iranian oil and the Iranian gas enters the global market, actually doesn't have sanctions on it, isn't the plaything of grand empires. They're not trying to constantly demolish entire nations in the Middle East, but this unbelievably vast oil reserve comes onto the market naturally and builds up Iran and makes everybody's oil much cheaper. On the other side of this regime lies a much, much lower price of oil for everybody. That's also part of this conversation. We can only see the bad side. There's also a good side, and it's massive. So, you want to live in the shadow of a bully trying to get a nuke that has already done this again and again and again? Go for it. I think that I can't afford to. It's told me this won't end until I'm dead. So here I am responding to somebody who told me I have nothing to lose. I submit that the world has vastly more to gain from this regime falling than they have to lose from this regime being in its death throes.
Do you think the world will wake up and do what has to be done? And by the way, Hugh Hewitt, not anybody else, nobody's told me this, think you have to destroy the oil infrastructure of Iran. You have to impoverish the nation and impoverish the IRGC, because they just keep pulling old IRGC guys out of retirement to put them in charge of a regime when Israel and the United States kills them. They've probably got a limited supply somewhere, but not for a long time. Are they going to run out of hardliners who fought in the Iraq-Iran war for 10 years, 35 years ago? They got a lot of those crazy people. So do you think the world's ready to do what has to be done, which is to blow up their ability to sustain their regime?
I mean, the Europeans, absolutely not. Europe has willfully made itself completely dependent on Russian energy and on Persian Gulf energy, something that is not true of the United States. And Europe has disarmed itself of militaries and the ability to project power, and Europe is now at the mercy of everyone else, of the whims of various Middle Eastern powers and the United States and everybody else. And so they're really very nervous and very angry and very upset. And we're hearing interesting things from the Italian leadership, from the German leadership, and from the Japanese leadership. Ironically, 80 years ago, the Axis powers, and they get the great danger represented by the ideology that Iran leads and isn't the sole purveyor of, but nevertheless leads in the Middle East. And they don't want this war to end with the regime intact. They might not have anything to contribute in terms of toppling it, but they certainly are on the side of the Gulf states. They're on the side of Israel in this war, even if some of them, like the Italians, don't say so. Ironically, it is the allies of Europe, the French, the British, who are utterly unwilling to see the actual challenge posed by these ideas and the destructiveness of them to Iran and to the region and to the oil infrastructure of the world and all of that. So I think the world understands. I'll put it really simple. If this regime survives this round of war, that is okay. That is okay. I was asked in the 12-day war in June this exact same question. You bombed them for 12 days, you killed a bunch of generals, and here they are still ticking. Yeah, this is a long war. This is not the kind of war that is exactly catered to the schedule of your TikTok feed. Like, this is a long, serious confrontation between deep ideas and ways of life and ways of thinking about the world. And it will be decided in time. It will be decided in investment, in will, in a test of wills, and in sticking power. And that remains true. So we brought down this regime a few very large pegs, and the world might, because of the energy prices, pull back. The United States might pull back. I don't ask Trump to lose the midterms for me. I don't think he's doing it for me. I think there are thousands, but not living under the shadow of Iran's veto of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz is reason enough to not have this regime rule for another 25 years in that region. But nevertheless, he has given me this great gift. It's a great gift to me, even if it wasn't specifically meant for me. And I don't have the right to ask for more, but we will have another war. There's no other choice. Iran will not stop fighting, will not stop demolishing nations, will not stop expanding.
Now, yesterday, Israel called up 400,000 reservists, if I read my Israeli English language press correctly. What's that mean, Habib? That's the whole shebang. That's everybody who can get called up, basically.
It's flexibility for the army. It's flexibility for the army. For Lebanon, for a longer-term fight with Iran, it is Israel signaling a willingness to keep going at a very strong level and to escalate. One of the things that Professor Shiftan talks about is this idea of escalation dominance. You face an enemy, and the enemy wants to escalate until you bow out, and you want to escalate until they bow out. Well, whoever can escalate farthest wins. And so the ability to project the willingness to escalate is very much part of this war. That's my sense of it. 400,000 people were not called up. The army was given permission by the political echelon to begin to do that in terms of logistics, which is mostly a signal.
Okay, does it? Do you think it signals that the Lebanon south of the Litani is going to be occupied on a more or less permanent basis? 30 seconds to the break.
What we have heard from Israeli officials, it's a big question of how much of it is rhetoric and how much of it is actual policy. What we've heard from Israeli officials is we have to root out Hezbollah. Hezbollah remains a threat. We will root it out until it is dead. We can do this forever. They claim they can. We can too. And we will hold south of the Litani until we have defeated them. Instead of Hezbollah saying that about Israel, back when Israel occupied southern Lebanon for 18 years, like America's Afghanistan experience, and then Israel left, now it's the opposite. Hezbollah will never not fight a war against us. We will hold that territory and hurt them until they are the ones who leave.
We have an ally in Israel that is really unique. We've never operated with an ally, even in World War II, at this level of interoperability and command and control. So it's really an extraordinary point in military history. And not many Americans know much about what the Israelis think of their point of view. And I list a few people in my Fox News column tomorrow, including Aviv, about whom Americans ought to be aware and follow so they know what our ally is doing. Now, our allies' politics matter a lot. The khaki election, Habib, I don't know if you remember in 1900, the English thought they'd won the Second Boer War. They hadn't, but they thought they'd won. So I think Lord Salisbury called a snap election, won more than 400 seats. The poor Liberal Party got smashed. They were below 200 seats because they have a really quick election in England, and you can do that when you think you've won a war. Can Bibi do that? I asked Nadav Ayali this yesterday. He said, oh, no, it's going to be in October. What do you think?
We're going to find out very soon. It depends on a very few people, and I don't like to predict what a very few people will do. It's easy to predict what 100 million people will do. It's hard to predict what 3 people will do. The Knesset has to pass a budget by the end of the month, and they might pass an extension and give themselves a couple more weeks or something like that. But if they don't complete the budget process properly and all the different things, then the Knesset is legally required to dissolve itself to snap elections, which happen 90 days later. So that would be July. If they do pass that budget, then the elections will be at their regularly scheduled time in October. What's fascinating about that is that this would be one of the more hated governments or more divisive governments in the history of Israel, which is, by the way, not unexpected after October 7, and it's also a much more polarized time than it was in many periods in Israel's past. So I'm not even accusing them of being somehow beyond the pale, although in some of the things they're doing, I'm extremely troubled. But it would be, even though it's one of the least liked governments, and even though it hasn't actually won in any poll that I know of since it was voted in December 2022, it will be the first Israeli government in history to last its full term if they manage to pass a state budget now. Where can they pass a state budget?
Huh.
I think so. I think so because the ultra-Orthodox are getting a lot of what they want, mainly a ton of money. The religious Zionist factions of the government are getting a lot of what they want, again, mainly a ton of money. And everyone is getting enough that, they're going to stick with it. As we get closer to election day, by the way, the various different right-wing factions are all going to need to try to cannibalize each other's voters because they have some overlapping constituencies. And that's a lot of the times leading up to Israeli elections. And this is true of many parliamentary systems where parties that are together in a coalition, share many ideas, tend to then produce all kinds of artificial crises to have something to distinguish themselves to their bases as they enter the election season. So it's not a big question whether the election is in July or August or October, but those are the kinds of structural things that we have to watch for to know.
All right, so last question, and you've got 3 or 4 minutes on this one, so take your time. Netanyahu has done a brilliant job in waging this long war. He got caught off by surprise, and he was wrong about Hamas, but he's done a great job waging this war, and he's got President Trump working with him, waging this war. And finally, we've come to grips with Iran over the skies of Iran. Finally. I'm 70 years old. I've been waiting for this for a long time. I saw Iran fall into chaos on the couch with Richard Nixon and San Clemente as a writing member of staff in 1978, 79, and 80. So I remember it very well. Do you think that matters to the average Israeli, or are they just as likely to do what the English did in 1945 and throw Churchill out after he was the only man who could have beaten the Nazis and did? Nevertheless, they threw him out because they were the English and they were tired of him.
I have to tell you, a lot of Israelis who really appreciate Netanyahu on the war think that he has hurt them, betrayed them, and led them in bad directions on a host of domestic issues that have no salience or resonance or really are understood outside of Israel for obvious reasons. How much does anyone else around the world understand America's healthcare debate, right? But elections can be about health and unemployment and not about the big thing that the world cares about, like the Iraq war 25 years ago or whatever. So the answer, as far as the polls tell us, is Netanyahu does not, his current coalition does not at this moment have a majority. It does not have a parliamentary victory. And it hasn't in any poll. Now, somebody will find me one poll by some right-wing pollster, I'll take that back. I'm not saying there literally isn't one, but I follow the polls very closely, and certainly none of the mainstream ones over time. Does that mean that the opposition has a victory? We don't see a clear path. We're talking about an election between, 16 parties, of which 11 will make it in, roughly, give or take. That's how it works. So it's always a kind of chaos math to try and figure out that path. But a lot of Israelis, they will say things like, Netanyahu pulled the trigger on Iran. That was terrifying. That was scary. That took guts. We didn't know that Iran would not respond competently. If it had responded much more competently.
You didn't. You didn't know that.
There could have been 2,000 ballistic missiles on Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv could have been on fire. And he knew the potential cost. He also knows the cost of letting Iran continue to develop, letting this regime produce the capabilities it wants to produce. The Chinese were literally, they signed an agreement a month before the war to hand Iran its first supersonic missiles. You know what that would have done to the Strait of Hormuz? An American aircraft carrier could have been taken easily by an Iranian gunboat. I mean, we're talking about an upgrading of their capabilities that we have stopped. And so Netanyahu pulled the trigger and made that absolutely terrifying decision. On every domestic policy issue that I care about, that my kids' lives depend on this massive welfare state over in the ultra-Orthodox community that is larger, they get more per capita, and they get incentivized not to work in a vast scale. Something like 50% of their men don't work at all. And the ones who do work tend to be low earners because their education system is a separate education system that doesn't teach math and English after 4th grade. Now, Israel is not a hydrocarbon power. Yeah, it has some natural gas reserves right now, but not compared to Middle Eastern levels, and that's very recent. All we have built with human talent. We have built with the simple fact that Israel invests more in R&D than any other nation on earth per capita. It is the number one on earth. That is what we are. That is our strength. That is our power. Now, I'm a big fan of religious education. I'm the son of a rabbi. I have podcast episodes about holidays and diving into the Jewish religious bookshelf. I'm a huge fan of religion. Oh, ditto Christianity. I'm a big fan. You've got to work. That doesn't mean you get to not work and move into labor. Netanyahu's expanded that. There was a law passed this week by this Knesset, when everybody else is hunkering down in bomb shelters, when people are losing jobs because businesses are closed. This Knesset passed a law that expands the powers of the rabbinical courts, in which women don't... I
get it. Yeah, good on the war, bad on everything else.
For full shows, live and on demand, it's Salem News Channel.